We are not dealing with ordinary criminals. The real force is more sinister, more obscene than any monstrosity you can think of. Lord of corruption, master of the undead, Count Dracula.
How's it going there, Bloodsuckers? Welcome to this week's episode of Halloweekly. This week's episode, we are interviewing author Jess Peacock of the book Such a Dark Thing, Theology of the Vampire Narrative in Popular Culture. And man, does this guy knows vampires. He knows them very well. I think he's good friends with Mr. Barlow, actually. So sit back, pop him in a cold one of some riboflavin-flavored, non-carbonated, polyunsaturated blood, or mummy's juice, whichever one you prefer, and enjoy.
I just want to kick off with the book itself. So, like, if you could just give people kind of an idea of the inspiration for the book, how long you were sitting on the idea. Go ahead.
I guess I sat on the idea for pretty much my entire life. I always, even when I was younger, saw a connection between the world of theology and the world of horror, specifically the subgenre of the Western vampire narrative. Earlier in my life, I was somewhat of a conservative evangelical Christian, and so I saw it in a certain way earlier in my life, more like the vampire being almost a parable in a lot of ways, or the vampire narrative being a parable. But sure. As I got older and put away childish things, so to speak, my ideology expanded. I stepped away from the church. I no longer consider myself a Christian. And while I still see the vampire very much entwined with theology, it's not as simple as the vampire is evil and the vampire hunters are good and God wins in the end. It's far more complicated and complex as life in general can be. And so that all sort of percolated for years and years and years. And when I went to grad school, I was doing an independent study on this, the vampire narrative and theology specifically. And my supervisor of the independent study was writing a book for Whitford Publishers. And he said, they might be interested in this. This seems kind of up their alley. They like to do religion and culture type topics. And he's like, you should send them what you've got. And I was thinking, I wasn't even out of grad school. I'm like, no one's going to publish me. This is not going to go anywhere. But I'm like, what the hell? So I sent in my where I was on the independent study with sort of a summary of where I would go with it if it got expanded a little bit. And they responded in a couple months and said, we would love to publish the book. And so I just and I'm like, oh crap, now I got to write it. And, but I had a pretty good core with my independent study. I had a pretty good core. And I knew where I wanted to go with it as far as it being I wanted it to be academic, but I also wanted it to be very accessible to the average reader, the horror fan who might not, live and work in academia. So that was the goal I had in mind and set out for. And the book itself was probably the first draft was probably twice as long as what it is now. And it was a lot of, it was a lot of, I don't want to say academic nonsense, but there was a lot of academic ease written into it that I was just like, I've really kind of overstepped my goals with this. And so I just went through after the first draft and just started cutting because I wanted it to be a fun read. I wanted it to be an informative read, and I wanted it to be an accessible read. So the editing process was just cutting all that fat off, and a lot of that fat was a lot of that stuff that had been percolating for years and years and years. I'm like, what, I can come back to this later, maybe in a dissertation down the road or whatever. Here's the core of what I want to say and convey to people. So, in a nutshell, that's sort of the story of the book.
Can you repurpose any of the edited out material for a sequel? Is that a possible thing?
Right now, my because I'm in a PhD program here in Chicago, and what I would like to do my dissertation on is I would like to focus in on the novel Salem's Lot, and look at Salem's Lot from a perspective of its kind of serving as resistance literature. And traditionally
cool.
resistance literature is literature that emerges from the marginalized in society. But what I would like to do is, because Salem's Lot is filled with a bunch of white people living in, middle America. It's not, but
Right.
that particular vampire narrative serving as a lens of resistance literature, the vampire representing the oppressive, institutionalized oppressive force, and these
Sure.
people representing the people from varied cultures sort of rising up against that oppressive force. So right now, that's sort of the direction I'm heading, and a lot of that stuff I cut could be repurposed, because if you said you've read the book, I talk about Salem's Lot a lot.
Yep.
A lot of the stuff that was cut was even more stuff about Salem's Lot. So,
Cool.
at the risk of it becoming a book about Salem's Lot, a lot of that stuff was sort of got set aside. But yes, I'm hoping to repurpose a lot of that here in the near future.
Awesome. So a couple quick preliminary
Yes.
questions. Was there a process of elimination through the horror genre where you narrowed down to vampires and the religious connection, or did you just key in on vampires right away and that was
The independent study started as the topic was the horror genre and theology. But with an independent study, you have one semester. And I was just like, as I got started, I'm like, there's no way. There's just no way. The amount of the amount of ground I would want to cover doing that topic, it would have just been, in that amount of time, just sort of a watered down, version. And so I talked to to the person who was supervising, the professor who was supervising the independent study, and I'm like, I know I pitched this. Can I narrow it down to this? And he's like, oh yeah, absolutely, go with that. And he's like, Godspeed. So and there are some wonderful works about theology in the horror genre. One in particular that I can just think of off the top of my head is Sacred Terror by Douglas Cohen. And it's a really wonderful book. I actually used it as a resource in my research. But having said that, the horror genre and theology could be volumes and volumes and volumes of work.
Sure.
So I think it's best to focus in when and where we can.
Well, if you were forced to move to another creature in the horror genre, so to speak, where would you turn, if anywhere?
I think there's a lot of options. You could discuss the lineage of Frankenstein from a man versus God kind of perspective and analyze that, and people have. You could go with the Wolfman and the idea of suppressed sin and human nature and all the everything that goes along with the Wolfman parable. For me, I've always sort of kind of wanted to look at, for lack of a better description, torture porn, and how I believe torture porn is sort of reflective of our culture's loss of hope. Connecting that to issues of politics and socioeconomic issues, and everything that has sort of combined to just sort of strip hope from younger generations and that sort of helplessness that they feel. And I see a connection there with 5 years ago we were in the midst, maybe 10 years ago we were in the midst of just an overwhelming flood of torture porn films. And we're sort of seeing that with the current season of The Walking Dead. It's so hopeless, and hopefully they get to a point where some hope shines in, but who knows. So I think all of that is very reflective of the current state of the culture and the current state of politics. And what is it? Over half of our country is in some form of, they're either poor or impoverished, and with no help really looking like we're not going to be getting help politically down the road, it's not surprising that we're a very hopeless culture at this point. And
that's really interesting.
So,
I mean, watching the faces of the news anchors covering the election, it looked like they were undergoing torture.
Right, exactly. And I mean, I'm a firm believer that I think culture reflects what pop culture reflects the wider culture versus the flip of that. And so I really think as these next years progress, we're probably going to see some really intense horror emerge from this political climate, and that's often a reflection of our anxieties. You know, horror very much is a reflection of our anxieties, and as our anxiety increases over the next several years, most likely we're going to see some interesting work out of that.
Do you consider horror genre a leading edge genre, like it's a canary in a coal mine?
I think it has the potential to be. I don't know that it always is. Now, I guess maybe I should clarify that a little bit. I think a lot of the horror that you see under the radar is often that canary in the coal mine. Horror, more accessible, big budget horror, I think is more common denominator, aiming at the wider audience for a profit. But, just off the top of my head, a movie like A Girl Walks Home Alone at Night, great movie, and really honing in on the issues of feminist issues in the Middle East, the search for female empowerment in a very, very oppressive patriarchal society. That's very much the type of, when you say canary in a coal mine, those are the kind of movies I think about. I think It Follows was very much one of those movies as well, in the sense of the sexual anxiety and relationship anxiety that a lot of the younger generation right now feels.
And the complete lack of
absolutely. Absolutely. I think there are aspects of the horror genre that very much do that, and they're often the ones that don't get the attention that they deserve.
Right. Cool. Well, let's dive into a couple of specific things from the book that I was really intrigued by. Nick, he's one of his absolute favorite movies of all time is Bram Stoker's Dracula. And you do a really interesting connection to the Book of Job, I believe. Could you kind of talk through how that goes?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I've always seen a strong connection between that representation of Dracula from Coppola's film and Job, because when you read Job, Job is one of those stories that, like along with the flood, that gets so Sunday schoolized in people's minds, because they hear a version of the story, and the version that we hear in the story of Job is that Job was oppressed by Satan and lost everything. He lost his family, he lost his crops, he lost his house, home, everything. But because he had faith, at the end of the day, he got it all back. Even though it was a different family, and those everyone else was still dead, and I'm sure there's no PTSD involved in that whatsoever.
No, he's fine.
And it all started as basically a pissing contest between Satan and Yahweh. I mean, the story starts off with Satan coming to Yahweh and saying, "Hey, that your favorite guy there, I bet I can make him curse you," and Yahweh's like, yeah, all right, let's see what happens. And so that's where it starts. And so that connection that I tried to make with Dracula was the fact that Job just didn't accept his fate. He's always painted as like this incredibly faithful servant of God who, while technically he didn't curse God, he went further. And there's a point in the story where Job says, "Let there be darkness." And what he was saying by that, and Job is, or the writers of this story were very aware of the creation story by this point. And let there be light. The act of creation, let there be light. What Job was saying there was, I want to invert creation. I want to reverse everything. I am so miserable right now that I simply want to reverse creation. So he was basically, what he was doing was identifying with chaos. The inversion of creation is the definition of chaos. And at the beginning of Bram Stoker's Dracula, you see a very similar scene take place where Dracula has been tricked. Dracula's fiance has been tricked. Was she fiance or wife at that point? I forget. Fiance. Thank you. That's what I thought. Mm-hmm. She was tricked by the Turks into believing that Dracula had been killed. She kills herself. Because she kills herself, she can't enter heaven. It's a mortal sin. Dracula comes home and is told by the priest that she's damned. And he basically says what Job says. He says, I want to invert creation. And he renounces God. And at that point becomes an inversion of Christ. Christ, transcends death. He rises from the grave and offers people eternal life by the consumption of his flesh and blood. And Dracula does that as well, from a darker perspective. His version of eternal life is one earthly based, where Jesus's was more in the heavenly realms, so to speak. But to me, the parallel was clear, and I saw that in the story of Job, and so that's where I made that connection, particularly with that. Someone who is so faithful to God, and Dracula was very much faithful to God. There's a line in the movie that I love where he says, where Anthony Hopkins pulls a cross on him, and he's like, do you think your holy trinkets will work on me? I who fought for the cross, or something along those lines. And this incredible warrior for God making that turn and demanding, seeing injustice and demanding justice one way or another. And both Job and Dracula did that. And I just thought it was a fascinating correlation there.
Yeah, there's a scene where he actually says the line, "Look what your God has done to me," right? Isn't that that's in that movie?
Yep, but right before he turns into all the rats.
Oh, wait. Yes. Right. The rat scene.
The rat scene.
Was there visual symbolism in that execution of the movie by Coppola that furthered that message? Well, or was it just spoken?
Well, I mean, I think there's visual symbolism clear throughout that film in the sense of that connection between Dracula and the Holy. I mean, at the end, he dies in the chapel. The same chapel where he committed to rise from the grave. There is the Mina's communion with Dracula, where she takes of the blood, and she has that unholy communion. She's singed by the wafer as well. There's all these religious connections clear throughout the film, and obviously throughout the original novel. The movie is surprisingly faithful to the original novel, other than the romance. The romance is not a part of Bram Stoker's novel whatsoever. But as far as beats go and scenes, and the big chase at the end, it's very close. But yeah, there's religious symbolism all throughout Coppola's version.
Well, you cover in the book some really interesting cases from other movies about religious symbols failing to stop the vampire or beat the vampire. I love the instance from Fright Night. It's probably my favorite. Can you tell a couple examples of where you find it interesting where a religious symbol fails to accomplish its goal of stopping?
Well, I think one of the most telling, and not to beat my own dead horse, but in the novel Salem's Lot and in the miniseries Salem's Lot, Father Callahan, when faced with Barlow, uses his cross to at first keep Barlow at bay, and then ultimately he falls to Barlow. And it brings up a lot of these examples bring up very interesting discussions on the issue of the power of the symbol versus what the symbol represents, or the power of what the symbol represents. And that's a very long conversation to have. But within the vampire narrative, we always have this impression of, you hold up the cross and the vampire is repelled and we all live, are saved to live another day. But they're always half measures. They're always you never see an instance of a cross killing a vampire. You never see an instance of holy water killing a vampire, maybe with the exception of Lost Boys in the tub. But that might be one of the few where it's occurred. And so that issue of, okay, so are we dealing with a symbol that has innate power? Does the cross have innate power, or is the cross a conduit for some other power? And that conversation then can be transposed into contemporary culture, where the issue of religion is religion itself. The construct of religion, is it powerful, or is there a power behind religion, whether that power be God or community or what have you? I just think through the vampire narrative, that just becomes a very fascinating. You can go into psychoanalytics with this discussion.
Sure.
Is the power of the cross in vampire narrative simply a psychosomatic response of something that was in the mind of the person before they became a vampire? And again, taking that into contemporary discussions, is religion powerful in and of itself, or is it sort of like a what is it when you have the fake medicine, when they give you the placebo? Thank you. I was having a brain fart. Or is religion a placebo where it just sort of, once someone knows that they've accepted religion, it's not the religion that changes their life, they're changing their life, but they think it's the power of God doing it for them.
Sure.
Yeah, so those are just incredible discussions.
What about running water and vampires? Is that pre-religious, old religion?
I mean, you do have a lot of old world, ephemera that sort of has gradually, because Stoker, a lot of people think of Stoker, he wrote the first culture, pop culture vampire, and no, Varney the Vampire, predated, Stoker, and Stoker took a lot from Varney the Vampire. But yeah, a lot of those things are from folklore. Some of them hold, they sort of make it along with the mythology. They sort of cling to the mythology and they make it through. And sometimes they don't. Stoker, to the best of my knowledge, was the first person to say that vampires can't see their reflection. And I mean, I could be wrong there, but I'm pretty sure he was the first one, and he sort of connected that to the idea, because the vampires don't have any souls. There's no reflection there, but that has then become just part of the myth at this point. That up to the strain, in the strain, when they see their reflections, it's all wobbly and everything. So it's just sort of the running water thing, I think, is just one of those ones that sort of has overall died off. Because I think one of the reasons is because it didn't really connect religiously in some point, because it was sort of like the religious overtones of the vampire up to a certain point, I think, just sort of took over, and things that the idea of vampires having to count, like they're very anal. Like if you threw down a handful of rice, a vampire would have to stop and count it before it could.
What?
Oh, you've never heard that?
No.
Really?
No.
Oh, yeah. There's it comes from folklore, and it's that vampires are very anal, and that two things. One, they have to tie shoelaces. They cannot stand the fact of shoelaces are untied. That's one. Yep, swear to God. And the second one is, if you have a good defense against a vampire is a handful of rice. If you're being pursued by a vampire, you throw the handful of rice down. They have to stop and count it.
How has that never been in a vampire?
It has been.
It has.
The sequel to
is it Andy Warhol?
The sequel to Dracula 2000. Yes.
What?
And it's actually a pretty funny joke, where, because they talk about that early in the film, and then someone's being pursued by a vampire, and I can't remember what they throw down, but it's a handful of something, and without missing a beat, the vampire just goes 1,297, and just keeps going.
That makes the entire movie worth it.
It's a great scene. So you get a lot of these folklore things that's some stick, some don't. I think it just kind of depends on the culture, what's interesting, what sounds cool. But because of the heavy religious overtones, particularly of the early Western vampire narrative, I think a lot of the ones that stuck were the religious ones.
I got it. So you cover a concept that I'm probably going to mispronounce in the book. That's basically like a Manichaean universe.
Yeah, no, that's right. Yeah.
Okay. And it intrigued me because this basically means the evil and good are black and white, to simplify, right? Okay. So can you? I know that there are just tons of examples of vampires being bad, right? But in a black and white sense. But what's the least Manichaean vampire movie you can think of? What's the morally murkiest?
That's a good question. Well, going back to Bram Stoker's Dracula, Coppola's, I think is a very good example of a very sympathetic portrayal of a vampire. I mean, who doesn't want to be loved, and who doesn't want to love, and who is not willing to go to great lengths to achieve that. And the way that story is presented, in that particular version of Dracula, Mina gives herself to him willingly. He does not. He actually tries to tell her, no, you should not do this. I don't want to damn you to this. And so very, very sympathetic. But of course, at the same time, he's also a creature of darkness. He has very, he has imprisoned people. He has imprisoned his brides. He has imprisoned Jonathan Harker. So there's a very gray character there, and that's something that I think the most successful vampire tales. That's because that's the human condition. That's us. We are, none of us are entirely noble. None of us are entirely evil. I'm going to leave a Trump joke out of this right now, but we're not. I mean.
Yeah, you're talking about gray area.
I know. But even someone like Donald Trump. Donald Trump is a human being. We're all human beings. Now, some of us may lean a little, depending on where we stand on the spectrum. Some of us may lean a little too far to the left or a little too far to the right, a little too far evil, a little too far good. But I mean, in my life, I have never met a purely evil person. That's not to say they don't exist, but we're human, and we're basically made of gray area. And so with the vampire narrative, I think that really goes to speaking to the human condition. Another one, I would say, off the top of my head, I really like the portrayal of Jerry Dandridge in Fright Night. Again, a guy who there's a line in the movie that it's just one line, but I think it speaks volumes about the character. And it's where he's confronted Charlie, and he knows that Charlie knows, and Charlie knows that he knows, and he says, "I'm going to give you something I didn't have, a choice." And that speaks volumes about his condition. He was not given a choice to be what he is, and he's trying to get by, and that he can do some pretty horrible things, but he sees. Embodied in Amy, the love of his life, and again, who doesn't want to be loved and who doesn't want to love, and so I think there's some really good portrayals of that. Now, that's not to say that I love an unabashedly evil vampire as well. I think that becomes a lot easier to talk about issues of oppression when the character is unabashedly I am the villain and twirling the mustache and whatnot. But I love it.
And that kind of surfaced on our Facebook page during the contest because Valak is probably
pure.
Exactly, and savage,
very much so. Yeah. A friend of mine today. I was going for a walk with a friend of mine, and she goes, "So what's the answer?" And I said, "What are you talking about?" She goes, "The vampire answer." I'm like, "Oh, right, yeah."
Right, that happened. The movie that popped into my mind first when I was trying to think of non-black and white. So getting ready for this, I was curious what the highest rated vampire movies on Rotten Tomatoes are. And the highest rated vampire movie with no volume of reviews is a movie called Thirst. But I'm not counting that because it's only got like 5 reviews. The highest rated multiple review vampire movies are Let the Right One In and What We Do in the Shadows. Right? Are the top 2. So, but Let the Right One In seemed like a really hard place to get a moral foothold in to me when I was watching.
Oh yeah, and it's a wonderful film. I mean, it's just it's a beautiful film. Yeah, and something that I remember having like this debate with a friend of mine at the end of watching that movie. I had read the book before I saw the film adaptation, and the book sort of touches on this a little more. But it was like, she's sort of grooming a serial killer. She needs a serial killer to do her dirty work, which was what I forget his name, but which is her original keeper. That's what he did. He went out and he got her blood, and he killed innocent people to do it. And and Oscar was going to be that for her, next. But there's possibly love involved as well. But it was that whole gray area. And again, here is someone who. I'm trying to remember if they addressed this in the movie. It's been a while since I've seen it. Sometimes I get the book and the movie confused. But did they address her transformation in the film?
I don't remember.
I don't remember that
because in the book it's against her will. I mean, she actually is when she is turned, she's actually a male. And
yes.
But we'll say her because that's how she presents in the film.
Yep.
But it was against her will. It was not something that she wanted either. So it's like it's this issue of when something is done to us that we do not want, something horrible, some traumatic event that we did not ask for, we did nothing to bring about. How do we respond to that? Do
right.
we respond by perpetuating that pain? Upon others, which is sort of what the vampires do. The vampire continues to perpetuate this trauma upon others. At the same time, it's hard to judge when someone goes through a very traumatic event and maybe in some way is perpetuating that trauma, because that's what trauma does. Trauma radically alters not only our psychological makeup, but trauma alters just how we act in society. And so it's very difficult to, I think, to judge people who have gone through very traumatic events and maybe some of the less than stellar things they might do as a result. And again, the vampire sort of being a portal into a discussion like that.
That's really interesting because it's built into
Oh, absolutely.
It, right? Like
yes.
you can't. Right. You can't not.
Right.
Huh. So, all right. Now, what I want to do, I want to dig into a little bit of the appendix to the book. I don't want to give away a lot of stuff because I just want people to get it and read
me
it.
too.
It deserves it. But there are some really, really intriguing choices you made. Did you know the list would be somewhat controversial to vampire fans?
Yeah, absolutely. And I even say at the beginning of the appendices, I'm not proclaiming any type of final authority on this. This is,
Sure.
There's several Dracula Hammer movies that weren't included that I absolutely love. That some people would say, well, that should be on there before Amy Heckerling's Vamps. Which, and I'm not going to argue.
But it's personal.
I am not, and I'm not going to say that this is the definitive list of all vampire films, TV shows, and movies. These
Sure.
were the ones that just grabbed me for some reason, whether that be because of what I talk about in the book, it has those elements in it, or it's just, I just find it to be a lovely film. Or maybe it's not
Sure.
a very good film, but like with vampires, John Carpenter's Vampires, it's not a very good film, but there's some interesting things to pull out of it that make it worth at least one viewing.
Yeah, and it's validated by, it connects with people. Like there was a person on our Facebook page who commented after the discussion about that movie, saying, I went to see it at the theater 8 times. That movie fascinated me, for whatever reason.
There is no accounting for, and I'm not saying this in a negative way. There is no accounting for taste. People like what they like. I enjoy professional wrestling. I know what people think of professional wrestling. I just get the biggest kick out of it. I've watched it my entire life since I was a little kid. It was a bonding thing for me and my son. But I get it. Professional wrestling is moronic and silly and stupid.
And the good thing is, if people give your list any lip, you just give them the people's elbow.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Or Sacco,
Exactly.
But
awesome.
But people like what they like, and I think we bitch and moan so much on Facebook and Twitter and everything about everything. It's like Louis C.K. has that whole routine where everything is wonderful, but everyone's miserable. And I'm not saying that there aren't things to be up in arms about culturally and socioeconomically and whatnot, but it's just like, you know what? Okay, Batman versus Superman wasn't great, but relax. It's a movie, you would think that someone killed their mom the way they react to entertainment anymore, and so I don't go to those links at the beginning of the appendices, but I do say it's just my opinion, and
it's personal, and you're dealing with another element in horror where it's also what scares you. Like I was scared as a kid by there's a movie called The Car.
Oh yeah,
with James Brolin.
Oh, that's an awesome movie.
and there's a scene where the headlights come on in the background in a kitchen window. And one of the characters is talking on the phone, and she doesn't see the headlights coming, right? And that scared the crap out of me.
That
right?
horn, the horn of the car is terrifying.
Yes, exactly. Now, this is not a magnificent movie by any right, but if it scares you, you remember it forever, right? So there's also an element of that. Like I was actually really gratified, and I know Nick was because this is one of his favorite movies. That Monster Squad showed up so high up. Why is it so high up on the list?
Because it was me. Those kids are me. It really. It's a wonderful tale. I love how they bring all the not technically Universal monsters because they didn't have the copyright, but in a sense they brought the Universal monsters together, and it really harkened back to my love of Abbott and Costello and when they would encounter the Universal monsters. But that movie spoke to me as a kid, and it speaks to me as an adult looking back and just being like, that was me. I was somewhat marginalized as a kid because I loved horror. And this was before horror was cool. This was before, everyone's watching Doctor Who, everyone's watching Penny Dreadful. Now it's cool to enjoy this stuff. But back in the 70s and 80s, not so much. When I'm sitting in junior high reading Fangoria and no one knows what the hell it is, or I'm trying to get my friends together to watch Salem's Lot, and they're like, "You want to sit for 3 hours and watch a movie, about vampires?" So it was that. That's who I was. I was buying finger extensions through mail order catalogs, so I could be Count Orlok. It's just. That was my childhood, and
awesome.
I had the benefit of sort of being alive during the last stages of Forey Ackerman's Famous Monsters publication, and I was able to, that was my entryway. Those first few or those last few publications that went out, and I was able to get my hands on those, and it just introduced me to this world of monsters and magic that I have been a part of since, and going back to the movie, that's me, and so it ranks high with me because I identify with it so strongly.
And it helps that Stan Winston's designs are still probably some of the best werewolf mummy.
Oh, absolutely.
Gillman.
Yep.
Today.
The Gillman is a wonderful design. It's close enough to the creature that you know what it is, but it's different enough that they can get around the whole rights issue. But a wonderful, scary portrayal of Dracula. It's just I think it's a really good portrayal of Dracula. I mean, when's the last time you seen Dracula pick up a little girl and call her a bitch? I mean, it's like you don't get that anymore. It's like, yeah, okay, that's what Dracula would do, because Dracula is a monster, and he would call a little 4-year-old girl a bitch. That's what he does.
And he drives around town in a hearse.
Yes, with a skull on the hood.
He's the perfect leader for the Universal Monster
Yes,
gang.
absolutely.
Yeah. I don't want Michael Myers driving, but Dracula, I'll give a pass.
Well,
He can parallel apart.
there's a great moment in that movie too that really speaks, I think, to monster theory, and that's where the boys are at the I forget his name, unfortunately, but the German character, the elderly German character in the movie, and he basically says the line, I've now I'm going to forget, but I've dealt with monsters before. I know monsters are real because I've dealt with monsters before. And the camera pans down and you see his tattoo, his concentration camp tattoo on his arm, and that encompasses for me anyways. What I like to do with monster theory is, these stories are lenses and portals into how we can view our world, and how they can help deconstruct our reality in ways that we can then begin viewing cultural issues and social issues and economic issues through these lenses that might help us understand them better. And so that scene, that line is like, he gets it. He gets it. Yeah. Why can't my school get it?
Well, that reminds me, there's an amazing thing that you quoted from Salem's Lot in your book, where it was Barlow saying, "Look on me in despair, I write in the ink of human lives," or something like that.
Yes.
Right? Is that, and that's just such an imposing, encompassing evil, right? You're dealing with a true monster.
Yes, absolutely. And I think that's somewhat of a good divergent point to discuss. When you have those characters, those vampiric characters in particular, who are so unabashedly evil, and I mentioned this earlier, that's a great entryway into discussing institutionalized oppression, because institutionalized oppression as a system is unabashedly evil. I said earlier that I've never met an evil person, but we can look around and see evil institutions everywhere around us. There's a reason why we use the term corporate bloodsucker. Because corporatism, capitalism, it has to feed off people, and it has to. People always say, we're trying to eradicate poverty, and the thing is that capitalism can't exist without poverty. We have to keep people in poverty in order for capitalism to function, and that in itself is an evil concept. That there are people who are being kept in economic prison because we need this system to function. Yeah, and so that's where I think that's when we begin, in my opinion, dealing with issues of just evil, pure evil in a sense, not people.
And there's symbolism that creeps in behind vampires with like the castles and I think of the Marston house in particular, right? Like you just have this symbol. There's a great story from. The Salem's Lot Studies in the Horror Film book, which is excellent. David Soul tells this great story in the book about they built the house at such speed when they were getting ready to film that they were standing outside the house, David Soul and Toby Hooper, and this car came around the corner and hit a telephone pole. Because the guy had lived there like 30 years and there was no house there like 2 days ago. It scared the hell out of him to see a house on the hill. But like that symbol, I mean, it just looms over the whole town, right?
Yes.
Like,
and there's actually in the illustrated edition of the novel, there's a wonderful picture of or a drawing, an illustration of the Marston house, and it has roots extending downward and outward into the town. And I think that's a really good illustration of what King describes in the novel of this house influences everything. And it's linked. We talked about trauma, or I talked about trauma earlier. It's linked to the trauma of Hubert Marston, who had the house initially, and kidnapped and killed children, and basically was a Satanist to some extent. And so this this town is already oppressed in some sense before the vampire even arrives.
Sure.
And I talk about it in the book where we can go down an alleyway of, in some sense, then the vampire almost being like an undead Moses, offering freedom from that particular kind of oppression. It's a limited analogy, I will admit, but it's still something to explore. But yeah, that overwhelming symbol of oppression that the Marston House represents. And I have a study book, a copy of Salem's Lot where I take all my notes and highlight and everything. And one of the things, because I read it multiple times a year, and I'm like, well, this time I'm going to read it. I'm going to mark off every time someone looks up and sees the house. And it was over a dozen times within the book. And it's like, it establishes that you can't get away from this oppression. This oppression is all encompassing. The only way to get rid of this oppression, or to escape this oppression, is to eliminate this oppression. There is no, there's no incremental change that's going to get rid of the Marston House. Right. They do it through revolution. They do it by fire. And again, and that brings up another debate of an issue of incrementalism versus revolution, which we sort of had that debate a little bit in this election, but it's just something that, again, we now have entryway into a topic in our culture that is very relevant and very prescient.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, way ahead of its time, or still relevant, like you said. The what do you think of the choices that the miniseries made to make the inside of the house so disgusting, as opposed to the book? Both valid? Like
yes. The original miniseries is very interesting to me because they did make obviously Barlow was a radical departure from the English or German nobleman, I guess.
That disappointed Stephen King. It was one of the few things.
It did, but the interesting thing about the miniseries was that even though they made these changes, I felt like it really embodied the atmosphere and spirit of the book in a lot of ways. Yeah, totally. Versus the remake of the miniseries, which got a lot of the beats right and even got Barlow right to a certain extent, but completely missed the atmosphere and spirit of the book. And even though like the characters were the same in name, they were miserable people. Right. Mark Petrie, they turned him into like this juvenile delinquent, and that wasn't the appeal of Mark Petrie in the novel. The appeal of Mark Petrie in the novel was his innocence.
Right.
Dr. Cody, they turn him into this disgraced, cheating doctor in the remake, and in the miniseries and in the novel. He's an honorable guy. He hears Ben Mears out, and once he gets empirical evidence, he's like, okay, I'm on board. I'm fighting with you. And then of course they're changing of Ben Mears into sort of like this opportunistic journalist, who is willing to let some military men go to prison as long as it got him his book deal or the Pulitzer. I can't remember what it was in the movie, but and so they just completely missed the spirit of the film, even though they were a little bit closer to representing the book or the spirit of the movie, even though they're. But anyways,
no, I think you're right. I think it like that. I remember Salem's Lot miniseries felt like the book fell on the ground, the pages opened, and the miniseries sprung out.
Yeah.
Even though there were differences, there's like an internal rhyme, right? Like there's a writer I like named Harold Bloom. Yeah. He's a professor. They asked him once. He's a Shakespeare expert, and they asked him what the most faithful movie adaptation of Macbeth was, and he said Throne of Blood by Kurosawa. And there's no dialogue from Shakespeare in that movie.
Right.
Completely, right? But he thinks it's the most faithful because it catches the spirit of something. That's the most important thing to do, right?
Exactly.
Is to catch, which the remake, I've never seen.
Oh, the remake made me like angry when I saw it. I was excited about it. I had heard about it. You know, I had read some interviews where they said, you know, we're trying to be more faithful to the book than the original miniseries was. So there's a lot of new places we can go because the original miniseries left a lot out. And I'm like, oh, great, that's everything I want to hear. And then we get into it, and okay, so if you haven't seen it, they how do I even describe this? They make Father Callahan, after his defeat by Barlow, Father Callahan then becomes a minion of Barlow and ends up killing Matt Burke in his hospital bed. And it's like, what? What? And you know, it's like, did you not read the Gunslinger series? Because you know, he's right in there. Come on, people.
Wait.
Yeah, I know. It infuriated me, and it's like, so I'm like raging at the television, and the person I was seeing at the time just looks at me and says, "You like this stuff way too much."
No, you like
Not
it exactly
enough.
the right. Yeah, exactly right. We're with you. So I'm intrigued by you know, horror movies have become a lot more respectable, and like you've said, as the process is, it's cooler now to whatever. And I see almost weekly articles in Hollywood Reporter about how horror movies are saving Hollywood and they're the last profitable, you know, like whatever. But there's a bastion of respectability called the Criterion Collection. Are you familiar? Okay. And I went searching last night to just see what vampire movies had entered the Criterion Collection, and it's mind-boggling what's in there and what's not.
Yeah.
Okay, so they have Vampire, the old Dreyer movie, right? Which isn't even mentioned in your list at all. Is there a reason that's completely?
No particular reason. I've seen it several times. I enjoyed it, but I mean, I might be in the minority here. It just didn't. It didn't click with me, in the way, say, Nosferatu did. You know, it just you know, it's just one of those things. You know, what clicks with you, what grabs you, and what doesn't, and that was one that just never really did it for me.
Well, now here's the interesting thing to me is, so that's in, and Kronos is in, right? And there's only one, I think an Andy Warhol Dracula or something, but those are basically the only three that have made it into the citadel of Criterion, which usually has good taste, but I think is really dropping the ball on this subgenre, right? But what intrigues me is Vampire and Kronos both are not really vampires, right? So is that why they got in? The vampires are still not respectable enough to...
I mean, I would be surprised if that was the reason, just because of the last 15 years, maybe 15 years plus. I mean, everything has been vampires. You know, so I mean, it's just been. I mean, we're sort of on the downward, I think, end of that. But you know, kicking off with with Buffy, and then Blade and Blade 2, even Dusk Till Dawn sort of was at that beginning stage, and then boom, you know, Twilight and Vampire Diaries, and you know, it became the vampire became easy money. So sure. I would be surprised if that's the reason, but again, I mean, I'm not with Criterion, so I'm not sure, but yeah.
I was just intrigued at the coincidence of they're only entering non-vampire movies. Nick has a Blade question.
Yeah, shoot.
Yeah, so Blade, I love the Blade movies, but I want to know from the vampire expert standpoint, what improvements did you see in Blade 2 over Blade 1, and why is it Ryan Reynolds?
Well, Ryan Reynolds was technically Blade 3. Yeah, yeah. Oh. Which I was not a fan of. I was not a fan of Blade 3. And part of the problem was Ryan Reynolds.
That makes sense. But Blade 2 is much higher on your in your appendix list than the first.
I am a huge fan of Blade 2. First of all, I'm a huge fan of Guillermo del Toro, number one. But I saw Blade 2 before I knew who Guillermo del Toro was, because I loved Mimic, I loved Kronos, but he wasn't the geek star that he is now. But I particularly liked Mimic a lot. I thought it was an imperfect movie, but I mean, you could see lots of creativity there, and it was a unique horror film.
Sure.
And so I was really excited to go see it. And when I saw it, it was the first time that I watched a movie where I felt like this person understands comic books. Because it had a flow of watching a comic, and he experimented with the movement of the heroes. I mean, the things that, it was an early stage of using digital characters for, and it didn't always look perfect, but they were doing things with Blade in like the action sequences that you knew wasn't wire work. People couldn't move that way even with wires. It looked like a comic panel, the way heroes move in the comic panels. And so I walked out of it going, cool. Yeah, Guillermo del Toro gets comics. And that was before knowing that he is a huge comic fan. And right, so that was my initial just like, wow, I love that. But also I just love the ferocity of the Reapers and that type of next level vampire that he was looking to make vampires scary again. And the first time I saw Blade in the theater, there were scenes where I was scared. There was, the Reapers were a scary image, number one, but just the way the scenes were shot, and there was true, the characters felt like they were in peril at all times. And I just loved that. I walked out of Blade 2 and went and got something to eat and went back and watched it again in the same night. I was just absolutely in love with it. Yeah, awesome. It was an amazing movie, still is.
That's awesome. I've always been puzzled by the concept. This is probably tangential to your field or interest, but I've always been really puzzled by the idea of psychic vampirism. And I could only find one example. It pretty much fails every time anyone tries it. There's a novel called Carrion Comfort by Dan Simmons where I feel like it got it mostly right. Yeah. Right. Is that a related concept, or is it completely different? And is it unfilmable?
Well, I mean, when we're talking vampirism, I mean, we can talk about emotional vampires, we can talk about psychic vampires, and it becomes applicable, to real world situations. I mean, who hasn't been in a relationship where they feel like the person that they're with was like an emotional vampire, that they couldn't exist apart from that relationship, and it just drained you, emotionally and mentally, and that happens. People end up in those kinds of relationships. I say who hasn't. I'm sure there have been people who have been in those relationships, but I've been in a relationship like that. I'm probably the vampire like that in certain relationships. Who knows? I don't know. You'd have to ask my exes. So I think that there's a lot of different types of vampires that that concept can be used for. As far as psychic vampire, I mean, it is difficult to I would think take outside of a novel, but there's a classic Buck Rogers episode where there's a space
Oh, that's
right. And he's a psychic vampire, and it scared the shit out of me as a kid.
Yeah, he was frightening.
Yeah, he had that big unibrow and fangs, yes. And he put it.
Totally
yeah,
alien.
And he put his fingers out like in the rock and roll Satan pose to suck Aaron Gray's life force from her. Yeah. Oh, and Life Force is another one. The movie Life Force, Toby Hooper's movie.
Yeah,
where to your point of difficult to film. Life Force is an unusual film, and some people would say it's a bad movie. I think it's sort of like a bad good movie. But it's difficult to convey that. You're right. It's difficult to convey that I'm feeding off you psychically. But I think the right writer and the right director could definitely convey it.
Oh, cool. All right, a couple quick questions for you before we wrap up. I'm really curious if you can tell the listeners a couple what's the best short form handling of the vampire theme, whether film or written?
Short form. Well, there's a really, I mean, to pick a specific one, that is a hard question. No, that's okay. There's a lot of good, short stories out there that deal with, the issue of the vampire. I'm going to go broad and say that it's out of print, I think, but if you can find it, it's worth it. It's the Penguin Book of Vampire Stories.
Okay.
Yeah,
Oh, yeah.
it's a lot of good stuff in there. I mean, it was edited really well or curated really well. So that would be one that I would urge people to seek out. There's I actually use one of the stories from that in the book where it's about that the Jesuit priests are actually vampires, and
Midnight
no,
Mass.
Midnight Mass is actually a novel.
No.
It's called Following the Way.
Oh, cool.
And it's about basically Jesuit priests being vampires, and they're indoctrinating basically a new person. And
I love that title.
and it touches on a lot of the issues I talk about, that the parallels of drinking blood and sharing the flesh of Christ, and that representing in itself a form
Sure.
of vampirism in some ways. But the book is chock full of really good stories. Another one is from the 50s. It's called The Mind Worm, and it sort of touches on your psychic vampire idea.
Okay.
So I would seek out the Penguin Book of
Cool.
Vampire Stories, and I think that would be a good place to start.
I'm always good with Penguin. I just got the Penguin Book of the
Nice.
Undead, and it's amazing. All right, if you were making a vampire movie yourself, any director, living or dead, who would you have make it?
Any director, living or dead? Wow, man, these are hard questions.
Nick's a great editor. We'll take on it. We'll take on any point.
Excellent question. I don't know how to answer this. So the director I love, I don't like the last half of his career. But if
wow.
I could get early John Carpenter,
Yeah.
I felt that he started going downhill a little bit around the Vampires period.
Sure.
But early John Carpenter, I mean, Prince of Darkness, The Thing, even what's the one with Sam Neill where he plays In the Mouth of Madness? Thank you. Yeah, which was very Lovecraftian in a lot of ways. I would say early John Carpenter, because I would want to do a story that is very atmospheric and relies on tension versus jumps or violence. Right. And I mean, in his early career, he was a master of that. Yeah.
Oh, for sure. Yeah, that's awesome. Awesome. Nick, any questions?
I just got one.
Yeah, go.
One question. All right. So we mentioned now that we know the definitive answer is rice, to get away from the vampire. Just a handful of Uncle Ben's. I just want to know, if you had to choose between two of these options to defend yourself from a vampire, which one would you choose?
I'm sorry. Could you repeat that?
If you had to choose one of these two weapons to defend yourself from a vampire,
No.
which one would you choose? The auto crossbow from Van Helsing, or Tom Savini's cock blaster from Dusk Till Dawn?
I think I would go with the auto crossbow.
Safe choice.
Yeah,
Safe choice.
Because if that gun misfires, I don't want it where it's supposed to be worn.
Wow, it's self-preservation.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Top notch. That's fantastic.
Crossbow and a handful of rice, you're good to go.
Well, Jess, this has been awesome. I love the book. Can you tell people where to get the book, where to connect with you?
Absolutely. Well, it's on Amazon. You can get it in Kindle or a hard copy format. I'm on Facebook. If people, I don't mind people I don't know sending me friend requests on Facebook. Jess Peacock. I also have a blog that once I got into my PhD program, I have not really been attending to it like I should. But it's called Such a Dark Thing, the blog, and you just Google it and it'll come right up. I have done a lot of reviews of TV shows, other books, movies, sometimes some cultural critique. I will warn people that I'm a bit of a lefty, so and I comment on stuff like that on my blog. So if that's not something you like, I understand. Just don't go there and flame me. I'm happy to have discussions, but yeah, I don't want to get in political arguments with people. I'm more than happy to talk horror.
Facebook's going to add a feature where you can throw rice at people who are flaming.
Good to go.
I'll be throwing a lot of rice.
That's awesome. All right, well, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. I'm looking forward very much to the things you write.
Thank you very much.
And I appreciate.
Thank you for having me. I'm more than flattered that you asked.